So much so that Ronald Reagan can rot in for real. Like, that man. Okay, hi everybody. Thanks for coming back if you've been here before, or hi, welcome if you're new. My name's Mickey. I'm a therapist, and we talk about therapeutic things on this channel. Today, we're talking about third places because I have talked a lot, both in main channel videos, but also on our live streams that we do on Fridays and the podcast that goes on Thursdays about community and third places. I also have a giveaway for you later, so stay tuned for details about that. But I want to talk to you today about third places, which, by the way, third space and third place, different things. Didn't know that. Third place refers to the phenomenon, or it's a label for this phenomenon or space that Ray Oldenburg coined in his book, Great Good Place in 1989. Basically, it's offered up as an alternative to first and second places being home and work. So we're going to talk about that today, especially in regards to digital community and online community, because if you didn't know, recently a piece of legislation signed to ban TikTok. So I have lots of thoughts. We're going to tie some things together and play a fun little game of cat's cradle. I know that this video is not an exhaustive or comprehensive discussion of the entire issue with every nuance that's possible to exist. I don't know that I'm capable of that, quite honestly. Like, I try my best. I'm making a good faith effort to include as much nuance and detail as is possible at this current moment. But it feels more important to me to have content that's like genuine and that I'm like passionate about in this moment, which sometimes means then like calling it when I'm making an outline so that I am still passionate and interested in the subject. But also I have been really making a conscious effort to embrace the attitude of like, done is better than perfect. You know, the reality is that I'm writing a college paper for you all once a week and then putting it up on the internet. And sometimes that means that the content that I make isn't going to encapsulate every single aspect of nuance and every single extenuating circumstance and opposing opinion and like, you know, detail and all of that. And like, I think that's fine. I think it's okay, especially because if I fuck something up or I miss something that's really important, I can trust our community to be honest with me and to tell me like, excuse me, you missed that. And then I can make a follow-up, right? And then I can talk about it again. But for what it's worth, I am giving myself permission to be an imperfect person. If it's true for everybody else that they're imperfect and still good, then it's fucking true for me too. So I appreciate in advance your kindness and consideration in giving me space to not do the thing where I squish all the passion out of myself by writing an outline that's 88 pages long once a week. So let's get into it. First and foremost, let's talk about Great Good Place because again, Ray Oldenburg, who was the sociologist that coined this term in 1989, wrote the book. Listen, I think there's some valuable stuff in there in like the core of the idea of third place. Obviously, if you've been here before, you'll know I'm a big fan of the idea of third places. However, there are some like problematic vibes with the book, as any like old white man sociologist is want to have. Again, I think the core of the value or the core of the idea is valuable. But again, it is important to acknowledge that like the book and like a lot of the discourse around it does very much suffer from white man syndrome. So this is not me endorsing that as a whole, but rather taking what works and leaving the rest. There is a quote that I think is really useful, which is that the third place is where you relax in public, where you encounter familiar faces and make new acquaintances. And that's like literally at the bread and butter of what we're going to talk about today, both IRL and digitally. Before we talk about that, I want to talk to you about this week's sponsor, which is Bellesa. I'm delighted to work with Bellesa again because everybody who clicks that link in the description and signs up for today's giveaway will win something, which is delightful. We are giving away free vibrators or free gift cards for vibrators, so stay tuned for details about that. In the meantime, I want to talk to you about Bellesa. For those of you who don't know, Bellesa is a bi women company and their mission is to empower everyone to embrace, explore, and celebrate their sexuality, which of course we love. And I also have some delightful goodies that I want to share with you today that Bellesa sent me. So the first toy that I want to show you is the Bellesa Thump. Look at her in her little charging case. It's one of my favorite things about Bellesa toys that they come in these little charging cases, which keeps them clean and safe when you travel or just like while you're at home. The Bellesa Thump is the de facto replacement for all external vibrators because this is the toy that does it all. I've talked to you about this before, but there is a clitoral suction on one end, a thumb technology on one end, and then a vibrator on the other end. So truly, whatever you're into, the Thump has you covered. One of my favorite things about the Thump is not just that it utilizes Bellesa's Pleasure Jet technology, but also that it has this like thumping pop grip on the front, which is not like anything I've seen on any other sex toy. It is truly a very unique experience that, in my opinion, you need to experience it to really understand what it's like. Okay, the second toy that I want to talk to you about is the Bellesa Thrust. This thing is a powerful and realistic thrusting vibrator vibrator. It has 5 insertable inches and a ring of swirling beads at the bottom. When I tell you that this thing will change your life, I am being so serious. It also has an external clitoral vibrator on it. And this toy, like, it feels luxurious. It feels fancy. They also utilize thousands of pieces of community feedback in developing this thing. And like, it shows, because this is truly one of those sex toys that, like, if you're like wanting to treat yourself, definitely check this out. As a person who has been around the block a few times with sex toys, I was like, yay, I finally found something that's like new and interesting to me. I really highly recommend the Thrust for like all people, but especially for people if you're like interested in something that's new and luxurious and fun. Okay, so like I mentioned, go click that link in the description and enter the giveaway, because everybody who enters will win something. We are giving away literal free vibrators or a free gift card for a vibrator. And I have seen y'all in my comments talking about your like $45, $55, $75 gift cards. It's a wild time to be alive. Highly recommend. So go enter that giveaway. Also, so show Valessa some love for showing me some love. Thank you again to Valessa for sponsoring this week's video. Let's go ahead and hop back in. Okay, so let's talk about what actually makes a third place. In his book, Ray Oldenburg has 7 characteristics that make up what is actually a third place. So I want to talk to you about those first. The first of which is that it has to be on neutral ground, meaning that no one is obligated or tied to the space, either financially, politically, legally, etc. People are able to come and go as they please, and there's not anybody who has like a vested interest in the space necessarily. The second thing is that it's a leveling place, meaning that folks of all walks of life and socioeconomic statuses are welcome there. Oftentimes this gets explained as the place being not like super pretentious. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the important thing about this characteristic is that there are no prerequisites to be welcome here. The third thing is that conversation is the main activity. This comes with a caveat, because oftentimes there will be simultaneous activities and like other things going on. One of the common examples is in a coffee shop, for example. It's normal for people to be like reading, studying, playing games, right? Especially like in the classic examples of a third space, we often see this represented as like, you know, the taverns in like years of yore. So there's like drinking and, you know, like hanging around going on, but conversation is at the central focus of a third place. Also, conversation that's lighthearted and humorous, that's important as well. Another characteristic is that it's accessible and accommodating. I think both in the literal sense, like especially now in contextualizing the importance of accessibility and accommodation for folks with disabilities and things like that, but also generally speaking, it's something that everybody is welcome to be there, and also a place where everybody feels as though their needs have been fulfilled. So this is in the like literal sense of being accessible to all people, but also in the figurative sense that folks are able to meet their needs in the space and no one's feeling like restricted. The fifth characteristic is that it should or has to be low profile. The words that are used to describe this are wholesome, cozy, and without extravagance or pretension, but essentially to mean that these are not places where they're like sort of a hoity-toity energy or like you have to be well-to-do to be there. We'll talk about examples of third places in a second, but just keep that in mind. Also of note is that it should have a playful mood and feel like a home away from home. So there is very much an energy of like conversations being lighthearted and open-minded. There is the caveat in some of these descriptions: the conversation should never be marked with hostility, which I don't personally agree with. I mean, it's not like I invented the thing, but still. We're going to talk a little bit later about the uses of third place, in my opinion. So I don't necessarily disagree with this, like, if it has hostility in the conversation sometimes, then it's never a third place. Like, I don't know that that's very applicable. But the home away from home aspect of this, and especially like occupants feeling a sense of ownership or like having roots in the place, is very important, especially because the purpose of a third place is to be a vehicle for folks to connect in community and to feel seen and to like really be involved in like the ecosystem in which they find themselves. So having that sense of like ownership or like a vested interest in the well-being of the place is really important. Okay, so some common examples of third places are bars, pubs, and taverns, coffee shops, parks, bookshops, churches, libraries, sort of. This kind of comes with a caveat because obviously there's the intention that libraries are supposed to be private, but there are parts of libraries that are well suited to conversation, so I think it counts, especially in a modern world where third places are disappearing. It's important. Community centers, malls. Also of note are barber shops and other like similar places specifically for the Black community. Third places are also something that we'll see sort of delineated amongst ethnic or cultural or racial lines, which is important to honor, right? Like as a white person with long hair, I'm not spending time in barber shops. However, that is very much a cornerstone of Black communities and things like that. So worth noting. Rec centers are also a common example, like typically the YMCA comes up a lot. I also wanted to give you guys some historical examples here because third place is not something that has like recently existed. existed, right? If anything, it's recently disappearing. But it is like a very important part of human interaction and communities and sociology, right? So I wanted to give you guys some examples of like where historically this has shown up for us. Common examples that people point to are the Roman Forum. If you're not familiar, it was like literally a central gathering place in ancient Rome. Feudal China's tea houses was another common example, which I found really interesting. And then the ancient Greek agora, I'm sure I'm saying that wrong. I literally looked up the pronunciation and I have forgotten already. The ancient Greek agora, I don't know, third pronunciation that I can't think of at this moment. But again, it's very similar to the Roman Forum in the sense that it was an ancient marketplace, meeting place where a lot of the city's populace would just kind of gather and be. If you haven't grasped already, basically third places are places where people are allowed to just be. There's less of a focus on needing to spend money to be allowed there, on having like a specific and stated purpose to be there. And it's also usually a central hub for social and community interaction. It's a place where you can hang out with your existing friends, meet new friends, and like craft this sense of belonging and forge these relationships in the place that you already live. It's a really important and necessary part of communities, and especially in people feeling grounded and like they belong. From a societal and a sociological perspective, third places have historically existed as the means through which people feel anchored to the place where they just so happen to live. So that brings us to the discourse around the fact that third places are disappearing. I sort of already spoiled it. But third places are disappearing, especially in the world that we live in now. A lot of folks, when talking about third places, will point to the fact that we as community members have a really hard time finding places in public to just exist and to just be, especially places that don't require us to spend money to be there. So much of our public community space is gatekept behind a barrier to entry being a paywall, right? Even things like coffee shops, it's common to see like signs on the doors and things like that that say you can't hang out here if you haven't made a purchase, right? Coffee shops that will make the Wi-Fi password, have you bought a drink yet? Like this is a very common issue in the way that we operate in public spaces now. And so again, what we're seeing largely is that third places are disappearing. I think this begs the question for a lot of folks, like, why are they disappearing then? So I wanted to dedicate some time to talk about that. This is an area that like particularly pushes my fucking buttons as a clinician, also as a person. I don't know if it's just the moon or what's going on. I'm in such a fucking pissy mood about this section of the outline because it just makes me angry. Like looking through all of the historical precedent for why this is happening makes me, you'll get it in a minute. So the first reason that I think is like primary on folks' minds of like why are third places disappearing is capitalism. This is for a bunch of reasons. There's like subsections under this umbrella. The first thing that I wanted to talk about is the suburbs and the advent of the highway system. If you didn't know, by the way, the whole reason that we're beholden to bitch ass stores like fucking Walmart and like big box stores is because of Eisenhower. Because Eisenhower implemented the idea of the highway system. We didn't have one before that. And so with the advent of the highway system and like interstate travel where you could more easily get in a car and drive from one end of the country to the other, came the advent of big box stores and also chains. We didn't have chain restaurants, hotel chains. Those are like the first two, obviously, that gave way to other like chain businesses. But the whole reason that we developed businesses, restaurants like McDonald's, for example, is because with the advent of the highway system, businesses knew that families in traveling with their kids for vacation and things like that were going to feel out of place and that they would have a desire for sameness and consistency. They would want to feed their family at a place that they knew what the food was going to be like, that they could expect some semblance of normalcy. So we invented chain restaurants and placed them all around the fucking country so that it doesn't matter if you're in Ohio or fucking Sedona, Arizona, that you can find a restaurant that has something that you're familiar with. This is also why we have hotel chains, because people would want to find a place to stay for their vacation or whatever. The theory anyways is that consumers would want this. That would offer like, again, some semblance of safety and consistency, and also especially for people who were traveling with kids, the desire to have like no surprises or like, you know, rooms or boarding that like wasn't what you were familiar with. So the whole reason that we ended up in a lot of the like capitalistic hellscape that we're in is because we invented the highway system, and that gave way to the prevalence for things like big box stores, which also gutted urban areas and small businesses, particularly in Black and other minority communities, by the way, literally had their fucking homes and their businesses bulldozed again and again and again by the United States government, just being like, fuck you. Since you don't have the money for your repairs, we're fucking building a highway through your backyard, which makes me so, again, this whole section makes me so fucking angry. I'm not laughing because it's funny, by the way. It's a coping mechanism that I have to deal with abject horror. Please don't start with me in the comments about it. Anyway, so all of this paved the way for our reliance on big box stores and chains and things like that, which meant then that as small businesses often would serve as like community centers and places where folks would gather, right? Like we talked earlier about coffee shops, libraries, community centers, things like that. The other like important aspect of a third place is that it needs to be a local business, right? We talked earlier about how no one should have a vested financial interest in the place. Chain restaurants, literally in Oldenburg's book, he talks about how chain restaurants are really not a good place for people to be trying to create third places because chain restaurants are like the enemy. They're the antithesis of third places in the sense that private business owners don't want their property being used for anything that's not bringing them profit. So because Eisenhower, in what is the most just startling example of white male mediocrity, accidentally invented the highway system that revolutionized the face of American travel and changed the way that we interface with shopping as an American collective, which then gutted small urban areas and local businesses and made it a lot more difficult for folks to create small businesses and to like financially support those because they can't price goods competitively with giant corporations like Walmart, for example, which meant then that in our local communities, we're seeing less and less local businesses pop up and less of an opportunity for third space. Okay, the other factor of this like capitalistic nightmare that's important to address is that the inflation and increase of cost of living equals more time at work for a lot of Americans, right? The advent of like the self-care industry, I think, tells us all that we need to know about how we as a society conceptualize our time, which is that caring for yourself and basically doing anything other than work is a luxury that you also have to pay for, by the way. The percentage of Americans who are getting a second job to make ends meet has also been steadily increasing over the past 20 years. We do have somewhat spotty statistics about this, especially because of the advent of things like the gigging economy. A lot of folks don't necessarily categorize things like driving for Uber or DoorDash or Uber Eats or whatever as a second job. And so it is also somewhat underreported in theory. All of this is relevant because when we talk about the use of third places, it's a lot more difficult for us to be engaging with our local community and to be carving time out of our lives to go and like stop by a pub on the way home from work, for example, because it's more likely now than ever that people are going to be like clocking in for a second job instead of hanging out to do leisure time or to have space within their community to just like socialize and shoot the shit. Another aspect of this is the debate between private property and personal property. It's a whole thing, to be clear. I don't necessarily want to dedicate all of the time today to tease out the nuance in why private property is inherently theft. However, private property is different from personal property. For those of you who don't know, personal property is the stuff that you own for your own use, right? So like if you own a car because you need to drive from A to B, that's your personal property. If you own a home because you live in it, that's your personal property. Private property is when either individuals or corporations at this point buy a piece of property or a thing in order to hire people to work in it to then make them money, right? They're not personally using the thing. They're using the thing as a vehicle to hoard wealth, essentially. The issue with this is that it relies on folks using their personal time. Like time is really the linchpin in all of this. That's like very difficult. It's a resource that none of us have access to an unlimited amount of. And so when large corporations utilize private property to then employ folks who have to spend their time, again, that they'll never get back and that you can't use for things like occupying third spaces, for example, to make a profit, this eats up the employed person's time, but also their resources, right? Because you're using your time, your energy, you're using your own personal property to then make money for someone else, and you only get a share of that. So the issue of like personal and private property is also relevant when it comes to the issue of like loitering, right? We talked about this a little bit earlier, but landlords, business owners, private property owners don't want their property, their real estate being used for anything that isn't providing them with an increased financial gain. So this is why we see the term loitering even existing and why folks are being criminalized, sometimes literally, for occupying space in a way that isn't, again, lining somebody else's pocket. So this is also central to the issue of like, why don't we have third spaces anymore? It's because capitalism ruins everything. Another important factor here is that third places have often been the birthing grounds for political rebellion rebellion and political discourse, right? So there is a vested interest in like the billionaire regime squishing our accessibility to these places that, again, oftentimes give birth to political unrest and are the home of discourse about how to like change our current political system, for example. We can see this historically, like literally the American and French revolutions were birthed in taverns and coffee shops, right? Like this is part of like modern history. But also this is playing out in a modern sense with the occupations that we're seeing happen on college campuses right now. Also of note, by the way, is that college campuses historically, not just now, but like historically in past generations have very much been a central place where there has been a lot of political discourse and a lot of political rebellion. So much so that fucking Ronald Reagan can rot in piss for real. Like fuck that man. Because in the 60s when Ronald Reagan was running for his, I think it's his second term as the governor of California, there were, again, college campus uprisings that were happening that one of his staffers literally talked about how dangerous it was to have an educated working class and how they needed to sequester off a college education to be more expensive and therefore less accessible so that we didn't accidentally create this whole generation of people who were highly educated and not of the conservative political ideals of which Reagan found himself. So first of all, if you have student loan debt and you're mad about that, it's Ronald Reagan's fault. But second of all, this is another one of those examples where like historically, quite literally, we can see third places in the form of like college campuses that had a very low barrier to entry, not none, but very low, at least compared to now, being utilized as a space for collective action and community activation, and that largely disappearing because it didn't suit the billionaire regime. Another aspect of this that I wanted to talk about, because I think it's important, is the repurposing of land and green space and open spaces to prioritize profits. A lot of what we're seeing, hopefully I'm painting a somewhat clear picture here, that a lot of the reason that we're seeing third places disappear is because it doesn't uplift the profit or the bottom lines of large corporations and billionaires. And so again, what we're seeing is that open spaces and green spaces especially have been co-opted in recent years to be spaces that make more money and optimize profits for whoever owns the land. So the United States Forest Service, one of the government institutions that does things with parks, I don't remember which one it is, link in the description, estimated that about 6,000 acres of open space are being converted to other uses every single day. We are losing, by and large, green space, and not just like third spaces, but also open space, like parks, even land that is owned but just isn't currently developed is largely disappearing. Another aspect of this is the general disappearance of public places for kids to just be kids, right? Aaron and I were talking about this when I was making this video or this outline, that like the McDonald's play place phenomenon, that was just like disappearing overnight, was not by accident. It was because McDonald's, like proverbial powers that be, whatever review board makes financial decisions for fucking McDonald's, realized that they could utilize that space for things like online or digital ordering kiosks, and also for more tables and other spaces to make them more money. So they got rid of them. To be fair, there were very much sanitary and hygiene issues with those fucking play places. There's been testing that found like actually very dangerous bacteria existing in those playhouses. So like, I'm not saying that we should bring back McDonald's play places necessarily, but I do think it's worth pointing out that, first of all, that's very much a thing that could be easily resolved, right? Especially if, billionaires that are making money off of our backs would just hire someone to like clean the thing, right? And pay people a living wage to like safely and securely sanitize these things so that we could create space in public for kids to just do kid things. Listen, I'm a child-free person and I don't have kids, but I do think it's a pretty well perpetuated misconception and misunderstanding that child-free people hate kids. I know that some people who are child-free hate children, but I would say a good section of people who are child-free aren't child-free because they hate kids and want to see them eradicated from the face of the planet. And this is another one of those areas where it's important to acknowledge that like children existing in the community is healthy for the community, and especially from a sociological perspective, that parenting, child rearing, creating a family, like safeguarding a family, is something that is best done in community. So we are all best served by creating space in public for not just kids to be kids, but also for parents and families to be families that are contiguous units and get to spend time not just socializing with other kids, but also developing and finding community for themselves, right? Like the loneliness epidemic is not something that just extends to single people or people without kids or men or whoever. Like, it's something that very much affects the community at large. And what we're seeing is that the disappearance of places for families to go and just like fuck off with your kids means then that the parents and the caregivers for those children are also feeling an increased social isolation, which is generally speaking really bad for everybody's fucking mental health. Oh, also along with that, I just wanted to acknowledge also that in the same realm that we're seeing the increased cost of living and inflation affecting the cost of all of our goods and services and all of that things, it is especially fucking expensive to exist in public with your kids, because even the places that are left that are devoted to being place for kids to just be kids and whatever are so fucking expensive. Like, I don't know if you know this. I didn't know this because I don't have kids, but it's like several $100s to go to Chuck E. Cheese with your kids for their birthday party. Like, it's astronomical how expensive it is. So again, I just want to highlight the fact that like you can in theory exist in public with your kids, but even things like public parks, right? We're seeing an increase in literal criminalization of kids loitering at public parks, and also families and groups being told that if you don't have a permit or if you didn't reserve this space, then you're not allowed to be here. There's very much a capitalistic energy to just trying to exist in public space, but especially so when you have kids. Okay, so I want to talk about what this means then, right? Like, especially for us as a collective, the disappearance of third space has far-reaching consequences. I think it's probably fair to say that there's like very little, if not no good coming from the disappearance of these spaces, especially because the access to third places in public is correlated with an increase in your quality of life. This is something that we can see definitively in the data. Feeling connected with your community and being able to enact that in a very real sense by physically being there is correlated with a quality of life improvement. And also, the lack of this is also correlated with increases in loneliness and isolation. I wanted to bring this up because as a therapist, like in our therapy training, when you go to school and all of that, they teach you how to be a safe therapist. One of the things that is like we're bonked over the head with again and again is that isolation, loneliness, and also hopelessness are 3 key warning signs to look for when we're assessing somebody's mental health. All of those are like the very first risk factors that therapists will look for when we're assessing somebody's safety and about like whether or not we need to escalate care, for example. So the fact that we're seeing this disappearance of third places that is correlated with an increase in loneliness and isolation, and for some people, hopelessness, very, very, very scary thing, because seeing that at like a larger systemic communal level is, again, I don't think it's surprising to anybody, but this doesn't bode well for our community's health and also our individual health, obviously. The other phenomenon that's important to address with this issue is the disenfranchisement that a lot of communities and individuals are experiencing, especially in regards to like our empowerment and our sense of efficacy for things like community activation, right? So we've seen in the past years a decrease in things like union memberships and in like PTA and other community organization memberships. But we've also seen a decrease in political awareness, not just in like voter turnout, but also in like self-report data about how folks categorize their social and political awareness and how apt they are to engage in political discourse and things like that. To be fair, that number dropped recently, and it's entirely possible that that's more of a relation to the fatigue and like collective burnout that folks experienced in a post-Trump presidency, because we have seen political engagement and voter turnout and like political awareness increasing longitudinally generally over time. But again, still worth noting, in my opinion, because this also is related to a loss of engagement in each other's lives, right? It's not just about like the political and sociological awareness. It's also about like our literal involvement and engagement with each other. We talked earlier about the issue with folks who have kids feeling isolated and feeling like they can't exist in public unless there's like a pretty large cost barrier. But also in recent years, I've seen a lot of discourse, especially as a therapist, folks sort of struggling with feeling like, I don't know how to make friends, right? I don't know how to find my community. And especially this is a really prevalent phenomenon for folks when they're leaving high school, when they're leaving college, whenever we leave these like formal communal institutions, locations, I can't think of the word, but that's close enough. The feeling of loneliness and like fear about like, how do I get connected to my community is really, really prevalent for these folks. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that we weren't socialized, that it was normal to just exist in public, in these third places because they have been largely disappearing generation after generation. And so growing up in a world where third places didn't exist, there's a sense of fear and overwhelm for folks. Like, I have left the last communal activity that I'll really engage in my entire life outside of work necessarily, but we're going to talk about that in a second. And that's like very dysregulating and disconcerting for a lot of folks because the fear is like, I don't know how to do this. So I guess that just means I'm alone. Like, I'm going to be alone. I'm going to feel alone for the duration of my lifetime. And that's not how it's meant to be. The other thing that I wanted to address here in talking about like adults and like just people generally struggling to make friends after leaving these communal milestone environments, that was the word, communal environments, is that there is also a greater push for people to conceptualize and to view their work as like your third place, right? These are your friends. That's where you meet your community. And like, no, that's not supposed to be true. Especially, I know that there's a lot of discourse about this on like TikTok and the internet that like anytime your boss tries to tell you like, we're a family here, it's like, fucking don't trust that because that's fucked up. Very much that, but also because this is again, part of the capitalistic motivation to brainwash us all into believing that it's totally normal for your entire community to exist in your work environment. And that's not true, right? The collective gaslighting that's occurred about how we don't need third places, your work is your family, is so fucking detrimental. And again, part of this concerted effort, in my opinion, on behalf of the proverbial powers that be, to alienate us from our communities and our sense of belonging, but also from our collective power, right? The truth is that there's a whole lot more people who are part of the working class and people who are part of like regular ass population than there are billionaires in the world. And the idea of these people being able to easily and regularly communicate with each other and to enact policy and legislation and protests and things that will upheave the like billionaire regime is very threatening to these folks. So we've all been sold this lie that it's very normal to just believe that your work and your coworkers are your family, and that's not true. It is very normal, it is very okay, it's very human to have a desire for community and belonging that doesn't exist at work. And also, don't let anybody try to tell you that you're being a bad worker or that you're mean or uncaring because you don't want your friends to be like only made up of your coworkers. It's fine. Like, people can make friends with whoever they want to. I'm not trying to police who you're friends with. But please know that this lie of like, you're just not nice or you're just being shitty or whatever because you don't want to be friends with your coworkers is a bunch of bullshit. And again, is also part of this larger picture of like capitalism selling us this lie that we're all supposed to just be super happy little worker bees and we're supposed to love our jobs. Like, no, you're not. No, you're not. Your job is supposed to be a small part of your life that provides you with a means to an end, and you are allowed to want a richer and fuller and more complex life outside of that environment. Okay, so I think the question at this point then is, what does this have to do with TikTok, right? There's been a lot of debate about the TikTok ban and things like that. There's also a debate about whether or not digital communities count as third places. There are a lot of folks who say that third places don't count, or digital spaces don't count as third places, and I strongly disagree with that. I have some stuff that I'm going to show you here in a minute, but generally speaking, first and foremost, they do meet the 7 criteria that Oldenburg laid out in his book. So in my opinion, it counts for that reason, but also because we as a society are seeing the way that we socially and communally engage evolve over time. And I don't think it makes sense to exclude what is a really large part of most people's lives from this conversation about community building and third space engagement. The other common critique that I've seen about categorizing internet or digital places as third places is that there's a lot of hostile discourse, that there's a lot of divisiveness happening. And like, listen, I'm not saying that it's not possible for the internet to create a really strong divisive attitude amongst folks, because obviously it does. I would say that's like a feature, not a bug of the internet. And also, I think avoiding things like bullying and divisiveness, that's primarily a conversation about media literacy and like more so about educating folks about how to use a tool properly and safely and with respect and kindness for one another than it is about that space inherently disqualifying itself because those things exist there, right? If we're using that metric to disqualify places from being a third place, then I think like bars aren't allowed to be third places either, because I've seen plenty of fucking people get in fights at bars, plenty of people get in fucking fights and disagreements at community centers and coffee shops, right? Like, the existence of hostile discourse there sometimes, in my opinion, again, doesn't preclude it from being a third place. It's more so, again, about creating creating acceptable community norms and about clearly communicating the rules and guidelines to folks, and about folks having an increased access to education, about media literacy in order to promote safety, than it is about policing the space, like criteria specifically. The other thing that I think is important to acknowledge here is that, again, while folks will land in different places about like the legitimacy of digital contact and things like that, the truth is that the vast majority of folks are on the internet or are utilizing the internet. This is another aspect that I wanted to address too, that like, yes, there is a barrier to entry in the terms of in terms of cost, right? You have to be able to afford an internet service provider in order to be able to access the internet reliably. So that's worth noting. And also, statistics inform us that the vast majority of at least Americans, listen, I would love to make these videos from a more international perspective, but it's really hard, okay? Regardless, the thing that I wanted to talk about is that the vast majority of Americans are using the internet in some form or fashion. And so to discount the internet as a third space in its entirety is not really helpful, in my opinion, because the truth is that a lot of Americans are congregating on the internet, and whether or not we personally agree with the internet or parts of the internet being categorized as third spaces, the reality is that it is a, granted non-tangible, but still a space that people are congregating in, and it's important for us to address the impact of that on their lives and also how we can use that space as a tool to promote people's well-being and best interests. Also relevant here, I wanted to share with you guys some statistics. The Pew Research Center obviously does a lot of self-report data and polling and things like that, and they found that 57% of all teens have made friends online, with the majority of those people making 5 or more friends. They also found that the majority of kids who do spend time on the internet are making friends, especially in the like social media and gaming realm. But like the point that I'm driving home to you is that not all teens or people use the internet, but those that do, the vast majority of those people are making friends and finding community on the internet. So again, it's important for us to have a conversation and a greater communal discourse, in my opinion, about how we can maximize that space to increase people's quality of life, to promote their mental and physical well-being, and also how to use that space as a tool, again, for like the greater good. This is specifically related to TikTok because we obviously are, at this point in time, I don't know what it will look like when this video goes up because the news is happening fast. But at this point in time, we have seen legislation passed in order to ban TikTok. There's a whole legal kerfuffle that's going on there. But I think it's important to talk about the impact that TikTok has had on like social and like political discourse, especially because TikTok does seem to foster a special sense of community, particularly amongst Gen Z folks. 62% of 18 to 29-year-olds say that they use TikTok, and 63% of teens 13 to 17 say that they use TikTok. So the vast majority of folks who are encompassed in the Gen Z and like younger millennial, like the cusper generation, are using TikTok and report that they're making friends, finding community, and finding places with shared interests and shared hobbies on the platform, which again is important for us to talk about because it's become kind of like a weird internet third space, but also it's become a vehicle to get connected to communities and like shared interests, especially in the form of things like Discord servers and group chats and other like online forums and stuff like that. It's also important that we acknowledge the power of a platform like TikTok because it is very much a potential means for increasing people's civic and community involvement. For example, Pew Research found that while the primary goal with online community is to usually find folks who have similar hobbies and interests to you, a secondary benefit of this is that it does, like not on purpose, but like kind of on accident, increase people's social and political awareness, especially on a platform like TikTok, where political and social discourse is somewhat common, I would say. Obviously, depending on the particular user experience, it is true that TikTok does also host a lot of political conversations from the very conservative and repressive and oppressive viewpoints. So don't get me wrong, I'm not out here saying that TikTok is like the beacon for like, you know, society's growth individually. But again, it's important to acknowledge what we know from the statistics, which is that it can very much be a vehicle for increasing people's political awareness and their like engagement with their civil liberties and things like that. Along with this, I do want to acknowledge at this point, obviously TikTok has problems, right? I don't think it's fair to say that TikTok is like some shining beacon of hope, right? Like we know that TikTok has a lot of issues. I personally, as a clinician, have very real concerns about its impact on our brains and like what the fuck it's doing to our attention spans, especially as a neurodivergent person. Like anecdotally, as a human, I can vouch for the fact that the constant overstimulation that TikTok provides me with has really done a fucking number on my brain and my ability to interface with being like understimulated, for example. But also just like for neurodivergent brains generally, I have a lot of concerns about the way that it's impacting our neurology and our thresholds for like lower stimulation. So like, again, I don't want to say that there's no issues with TikTok, because there are, in my opinion, like really serious issues that I think we're going to have to contend with in years to come. I don't know why that came out of my mouth that way. If you have been on the channel for any length of time, you will also know that I am fiercely passionate about user privacy. So I do want to also acknowledge the inherent risk that exists with a user or with a platform that has been accused of mining and using user data and like violating people's privacy. But for example, this is why I also hate institutions like Meta, like Twitter, that are also mining our data, that are allegedly, that have also been accused and like been the subject of litigation for things like violating user privacy. So again, I don't want to discount the issues that exist here. And also, I think there's a useful conversation to be had about the potential benefit that it provides us. Oh, also, I wanted to pause and acknowledge here as well that me talking about the use of TikTok and me being an advocate or like a dissenter, I guess, about the TikTok ban. That came out of my mouth backwards. You get it. Me being not a fan of the TikTok ban doesn't mean that I'm a fan of ByteDance, right? Like it is important for us to center our understanding of this conversation in the fact that companies like ByteDance, large companies, they don't give a fuck about us, right? It's not that we're friends with the CEO of TikTok, because like, listen, it may be like a very kind and like benevolent affect on the front, but the truth is that you don't become a billionaire without exploiting people. So like, fuck all billionaires, in my opinion. It's not that I have some kind of special interest in defending these people specifically. It's just that I think the benefit of this platform outweighs the benefit that's being provided by other platforms that are also allegedly violating our privacy. Okay, so I want to talk to you about like what this looks like moving forward, right? Because in the wake of a TikTok ban, I do think it's really critical for us to be making a conscientious effort to find and foster and to create third places. In my opinion, a lot of this is going to look like connecting with friends and like creators even, or other groups that you found on that platform in other places. Obviously, like I'm a big fan of our own fucking Discord server, but like Discord servers, online chat rooms and servers and things like that can very much be a vehicle for community. We talked earlier about the research supporting the positive benefit of engaging with community online. And so choosing to foster an involvement or an engagement with those places is really important. And again, while I'm not a fan of TikTok being banned, I do think it's possible to recreate a somewhat similar benefit in other places. So I want to encourage people in these moments where there is a pull towards hopelessness and fear, which are very valid, to be clear. You're very human in that, and like, same. And also, it's helpful for us to recenter our focus on choosing empowerment and like uplifting ourselves and our community, and remembering that like while TikTok, especially like if TikTok does actually end up getting banned, it will have been this very special moment in time that was like kind of strange and like weird, hard to understand if you weren't a part of it. I think I will always carry like a nostalgia for like the early days of TikTok. And also TikTok is not unique in the sense that we as a collective can create a similar impact in other places, right? Like the magic of TikTok, in my opinion, has nothing to do with ByteDance or like the actual powers that be at TikTok. It has to do with the community. The reason that the community is so fucking cool and the reason it's so captivating and that it's such a social phenomenon for people is because of the people who are on the platform. So please remember, remind yourself, remind your friends, the folks who are in your community, that creating this third place and like recentering our focus on creating a connection and a community, even digitally, is very important and is also like a feasible thing that we can do. I also want to encourage you guys to connect with each other safely, right? Like this is another important aspect of this, is to please be a conscientious consumer about the communities that you're engaging with and where you're finding those people. And also continue to speak about the importance of technology in fostering and connecting us, right? It is very much a tool. And I think especially when we as a collective are choosing to uplift and empower resources that teach us about media literacy. I can make a whole video about media literacy if you want me to. I have a lot of thoughts about it. But especially when we're being provided with education and resources about media literacy and about using technology in a way that is empowering and loving and respectful of our fellow human beings, it can very much be a vehicle for not just connection, but also radicalization, community activation, resistance, things like that, right? And also, listen, I know this, it's like such a millennial thing, and you can make fun of me if you want to. I know that we live in a fascist police state, and also I am going to encourage you still to exercise your civil liberties, right? Become more politically and civically engaged, exercise your right to vote, use your voice in some capacity. Again, I know that there's like a whole evolving discourse around that. And like, I, as a white lady, don't necessarily get to speak over top of, well, I don't get to speak over top of people. And also, again, I'm going to make my millennial plea in this video for people to be civically involved in some form or fashion. But also, I think like the key takeaway from this video, especially in all of the like learning that I did in making this outline, is a plea. If you take nothing else away from this video, please give yourself the space and the time and the resources to whatever degree you're able to educate yourself. Like however you can. A lot of us, especially in America, were robbed of an accurate and also an unbiased education. And I am continuing, especially, this is one of the things I love about this job the most, is that I'm continuing to unlearn stuff that I'm like, wow, that was so wrong. I don't know where they got off trying to fucking teach us that it went down this way, but it didn't. Continue to educate yourself. Libraries are not only an important remaining third place in the communities, but they're also a resource that are free and really important and can provide you with a lot of benefit, not only in being able to like use computers and access the internet for free, for example, but also literally in reading, right? Like very few anyways, librarians are going to look at you sideways if you rent a book and then go sit and read it at the library, right? Like they are very much an important and valued part of our communities that also need your support. So not only is it something that can provide you with benefit, but you can also provide your community with benefit by continuing to utilize this resource and proving that we do in fact need this. You don't necessarily have to do this at the library though. Obviously listening to things like reputable podcasts, talk radio, whatever, creators, like all of that stuff is a valuable resource in terms of educating ourselves, and also practice developing media literacy skills. I know that I've talked a lot about media literacy. It's because I'm hyper fixated on it. I think it's really important for us to continue flexing these skills in being able to suss out misinformation and disinformation, being conscientious consumers of information on the internet, and choosing to interrogate our biases, our assumptions where they exist, so that we can continue to absorb fact-based and real information. And also, again, I already said that. I was going to encourage you guys to interrogate your biases, so you get it. I'll spare you the speech a second time. The last thing that I wanted to talk to you guys about is that for me, both from a historical perspective and also like a clinical perspective, the rhetoric that's being used right now to justify banning TikTok and like essentially robbing us of our digital third space feels eerily similar to the discourse that was used to like insist we must charge college tuition after there were a series of college protests and uprisings and things like that. Conservatives spoke then pretty loudly and now pretty overtly again about how dangerous it is for them to have an educated working class in this country specifically. So please know that while it can feel very hopeless, one of the best things that we can do as a community is choose to take our knowledge and take our empowerment back, right? Take your community back. Choosing to be involved, choosing to be empowered and educated to whatever degree that's accessible to you is very much an act of resistance and an act of rebellion. And it's also correlated with an improved quality of life and an improvement in your mental health. So take care of yourselves, be kind to yourselves, and also again, please remind yourselves and your loved ones and your communities and other people that yes, this feels really bad. Yes, it is very scary. And also we do very much have real resources at our disposal to improve not just our individual quality of life, but also that of our community and our larger spaces that we occupy. So I love you all the most. Please be kind to yourselves. If you guys like this video, you can like the video. Obviously we make content like this somewhat rarely, but we also talk about pop culture. If you want to come watch reality TV with a therapist, you can come do that on Fridays. And yeah, you can share the video to help the channel grow and to help each other grow. And I will see you guys next Saturday. Okay, bye.